Hi everyone, welcome to another Hatton's Model Railways live stream, and today we've got a real railway profile for you. We're looking at some of the largest express locomotives designed by and for the London Midland Scottish Railway. We'll be covering a lot of different classes in today's stream, some of your favourites in there, including the likes of the Royal Scots, the Princess Coronations and more. These locomotives spending many years operating on the LMS network, running from London Euston right through along either the West Coast or the Midland main lines up into the north of England and into Scotland too. I'll be showing you some of the great models that you can pick up right now of these locomotives in 00 scale and in N gauge too. So we'll be taking a look at those throughout the stream. If you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate them to put in the chat and I'll answer as many as I can as we go. If there's something you do want to check up on and you're watching a little later, please do feel free to leave a comment under the video or get in touch with our customer experience team too. We'd be more than happy to help you out. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you will notice that this is a topic we have covered before. Unfortunately, at the time, we did run into some quite major technical issues on the stream. So I thought I'd bring this topic back for you today to cover it in full detail. I've also prepared a lot more images and historical information for you. So if you did watch it the first time, there's still a lot for you to learn and enjoy watching us today. So let's get started. We are going to cover mainly the locomotives built by the London Midland Scottish Railway. So those locomotives that came into service in the formation of the company in 1923, such as the London North Western Railway Clawton that we can see on the screen here now, won't be covered into today's stream unless they do feature as a relevant part of the history that we are covering. So if you're looking for some of these pre-grouping designs, do head over to our website where we have a little bit more information on them. But the main topic for today will be locomotives built by the railway itself. But let's start at 1923. Let's get an idea of how the LMS railway looked at this time. Many companies formed the LMS at the time of the grouping, including the London North Western Railway that we have just seen, the Midland Railway, the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway, all with their own locomotive designs and policies for operation there too. None of these companies really had experimented much with the Pacific wheel arrangement, the 462, and indeed, mainly the London North Western and the Lancashire and Yorkshire were the only companies to experiment with the larger 460 express locomotive designs. This led a bit of a shortage during the late 1920s. They didn't really have the locomotives to match up to the likes of the Castle locomotives being brought in on the Great Western Railway and the brand new Gresley Pacifics being introduced to the London North Eastern Railway throughout 1923, 1924 and 1925 too. So Henry Fowler, who'd come over from the Midland Railway, started development of a 462 Pacific locomotive in 1926. This was started to be designed at Derby, who had been quite happy with a smaller locomotive policy, not building designs as big as this. In the end, we didn't quite get the 462 that was promised, but the first brand new express locomotive design for the London Midland Scottish Railway was the Royal Scot that we can see here on the screen now. So these locomotives brought in from 1927 onwards, they were quite a climb up from what had gone before, especially on the Midland Railway, but quite more powerful too than the Clawtons and the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway Dreadnought locomotives that had gone before. These were built over a 3-year period with North British Locomotive Company in Glasgow building 50 of the locomotives and 20 of them being built at the LMS's works in Derby. So these were Fowler designed, and you can see the influence there with the Midland Fowler style tender and the lack of sloping to the front of the smoke box there too. So this really was a development of the larger Midland designs with some influence from the LNWR and the LMY designs too. So these locomotives came into service, started operating on the routes across the London Midland Scottish Railway, taking over the operation of the express duties there. Unfortunately, in this original condition, they didn't quite have the power they were expected to. They were still quite poor performers compared to other locomotives being introduced by other companies that we have previously mentioned. But with 70 of these on the company's books by the end of 1930, they really were starting to make an appearance on the scene, and they can make an appearance on your model railway too. If you have them in this era, of course, we're looking at the popular Crimson Lake colour scheme that we see here. And this is the standard LMS livery right through from the mid-1920s up until the Second World War. And this locomotive is a Bachmann model. They do come up from time to time on our pre-owned selection, so they are worth a look. It's a model that's not been available new for a little bit of time. It was also part of the mainline railways range too. So again, if you are looking for a cheaper model of an express locomotive, these are a great place to look. As far as I'm aware, there's no N-gauge model of the original style Royal Scots that's been made yet. But if you wanted to, you could convert one of the later models, which is a topic we'll be covering very shortly on today's stream too. So with the larger locomotives that we've seen here, there was still a demand for large locomotives coming into service. Not quite as large a requirement as the Royal Scot, but still a more powerful, larger design was needed. So the London Midland Scottish Railway turned back to the Clawton locomotives, this being one of the larger Clawtons as it was known. These were brought in by the London North Western Railway, and 2 of them were rebuilt with Royal Scot chassis and the boilers coming from the Clawton locomotive that we've seen here. So these were rebuilt as trial locomotives to see if they could make a more lightweight version of the Royal Scot. They did. It worked quite well as a test, actually. The parts coming together did work out quite well, and this gave rise to what we know now as the Patriot locomotives. With them being a smaller version of the Royal Scot, these were also known as Baby Scots, and again made several appearances across different parts of the region. The first 40 of these were actually pretty much paperwork exercises. They were stated that they were rebuilt versions of the original Clawton locomotives, but very, very little remained of these initial LNWR designs. They were still brand new locomotives being built, but maybe a bit of a dodge on the books, Dirt. I believe there was less tax you had to pay on a rebuilt locomotive than building a whole new loco. So even though the LMS were on the quiet, building brand new locomotives, they entered the books as very rebuilt Clawton designs. Certainly 40 of the locomotives did achieve that status too, but they are a very different looking locomotive, as we can see here on this Hornby model. We can still see there the Clawton boiler, but the underframe is very similar to that of the Royal Scot, and they are paired with the standard Fowler designed tender on this locomotive too. So this model is a Hornby model. This dates back to the 1980s. This was one of the high detailed models that came through at the time. It still is part of Hornby's range. It's now in the railroad range with a 5-pole motor and a 8-pin digital decoder socket too. You can pick it up in quite a few different liveries, including the LMS Crimson Lake that we see here and some of the later BR liveries. These locomotives survived into the BR era in this original condition, running through until the late 1960s. If you do want one in that later condition with a little bit more detail, you can also pick up the Bachmann branch line model from our pre-owned department. These do come with an 8-pin decoder socket and space for a sound speaker, as well as lots of different variations in names and running numbers and liveries on there too. So the super detail model of these Baby Scots is also available on the market. As Kingory spotted there, the models are available. You can pick these up. So we've covered the 460s. We're still in the Fowler era of the LMS here, though. We're still looking at the time when smaller locomotives were being built than the competition were making. By this time, of course, we had the Lord Nelsons on the Southern Railway, we had the King class on the Great Western. We just started to see the first rebuilds of the A3 Pacifics over on the London Northeastern. So these designs, while reliable, still were quite smaller than what other railways were producing. This was about to completely change as Fowler was out and Stanier was in. Sir William Stanier transferred over from the Great Western Railway in the early 1930s. He'd been studying under Charles Collett there and some of the other chief mechanical engineers, learning his trade in how to design and build steam locomotives. So gone is the Midland influence and in is the Great Western influence. And we can see this on one of his first designs for the LMS, a complete departure than everything's gone before. This is the Princess Royal 462 locomotive, the first major Pacific class built for the LMS. There were two of these locomotives introduced in 1933 as purely experimental designs. If you're a fan of the Great Western, you might be watching the wrong video with an LMS theme today, but if you are a fan of the Great Western, you'll see the Great Western influence here, and you'll spot a lot of common features that were also on the Great Western Kings. In fact, the Princess is pretty much a Great Western King with quite a few conversions there, a few little extra bits and pieces, but the design was very heavily influenced by Stanier's time at Swindon, so you can really start to see the Great Western effect take place here. These two locomotives completely outclassed the Royal Scots and the baby Scots that had gone before, providing a great haulage capacity to be able to run over the steep hills on the West Coast Main Line route, through the north of England, through the Cumbrian Fells, and also over the hills from Carlisle, heading over Beatock Summit to Glasgow. They needed a powerful locomotive that was capable of fast speeds when running in the increased level of competition with the London North Eastern Railway. So these two locomotives were trialled over a period of 2 years. In the meantime, 10 more of these locomotives were commissioned, being named after princesses and members of the royal family, hence the Princess Royal name. On paper, a specification for a Super Royal Scot was intended, and whilst it is quite a different design, it certainly is an upgrade from those locomotives, and they started to come into service in this period. There was also an experimental turbine locomotive made on a Princess Royal chassis at this time. Number 6202, commonly known as the turbo motive, was trialled throughout the 1930s and 1940s. It wasn't the most successful. The design was a little bit out there, and it was rebuilt into a conventional locomotive in 1952. The Princesses themselves carried on in service until the early 1960s, with British Rail still working on those express passenger duties for their entire careers. Having a look at the models, a lot of us will be familiar with the very early model that we see here from the Triangle range in the 1950s and 1960s. Many out there will have had one of these on their first train sets, or maybe seen one on their relatives' train sets too. And these, for the time, were a great model with a lot of detail, but showing just how far models have come in the 60 years or so between them. This is the latest Hornby model of the Princess Royal in 00 gauge that you can pick up right now in a variety of liveries. This, as you'd expect, does have all the mod cons we expect on models today. And you can get the full digital socket on there. You've got 8-pin digital capacity, all-wheel pickup, 5-pole motor in the front. The usual expectations we've got with the Hornby Pacific locomotives. You can pick them up in a variety of liveries. I've got a BR blue one in front of me here today, showing the express passenger livery of British Rail in the early 1950s there. But do head over to the link in the description, not only for the Princesses, but every single locomotive I am showing you today. So we've got a really successful 462. We still need something a little bit smaller that has less weight so it can go onto more routes on the LMS, but it does need to be an upgrade from those Royal Scots, which were starting to have steaming problems in the early 1930s. What we arrive at now is the Jubilee locomotives. Very similar to the LMS Black 5 design that had been brought in. This was an upgrade of that particular design with a 3-cylinder configuration rather than the 2 on the Black 5s, but very similar layout otherwise, with the now familiar Stanier tender replacing the Fowler tender that is on the back of some of the locomotives we've looked at before. There was 191 of these locomotives built over a 3-year period. These were introduced to the railway in 1934 and they were built until 1936. The reason behind the name is the first locomotive, number 5552, was named Silver Jubilee after the 25 years anniversary of the reign of King George V, when the locomotives were introduced in 1934. So that gave rise to the nickname of these locomotives being named Jubilees, but they were named after various territories within the British Empire, as well as some mythical figures from Greek and Roman religions there too. So you can see these locomotives again coming into service, supplementing the Royal Scots and the Patriots on a lot of those secondary express duties, working on services across the Transpennine routes, working on services on the Midland Main Line, and also some of the not quite as fast express services on the West Coast Main Line itself. As we're looking at the models, the N-gauge model that's been out for a couple of years now, but is fantastically detailed, is available from Graham Farish in quite a few different variations. We can see this 1930s condition logo here in the LMS Crimson Lake livery of the time. Heading over to 00, whilst there is a mainline railways locomotive that was brought in the late 1980s, they are a fantastic amount of model for the money. You can pick them up quite cheaply on our pre-owned department. If you do want a fully super detailed digital ready model, you are looking at the Bachmann model of the Jubilee that's been on the market for around 10 years now. But don't let that fool you. It is a fantastic model when it comes to detail. There's a lot of tooling variations there for the different types of boilers, tenders, and smoke boxes fitted to the Jubilees throughout their lives too. So we're leaving the 460s behind now. We've had a quick journey back there with the Jubilee that we can see on the screen, but now we're heading back to our Pacifics. As we had mentioned before, the Princess Royal was seen at first to be a super Royal Scot, but with the introduction of the LNER Gresley A3s and A4s, a new locomotive more powerful than the Princess Royal was needed to be brought in on the London Midland Scottish Railway, with the specification this time being for a super Princess Royal. So we have the 462 wheel arrangement here of the Princess Royal. It was tasked to William Stanier to improve on this design, make a more powerful locomotive capable again of hauling fast, heavy trains over those steep routes. So it really needed all 3 major qualities there. It needed speed, it needed power, and it also needed to compete with the locomotives on the London North Eastern Railway. So this design came about. Again, the Super Princess Royal evolved into what we now know as the Princess Coronation, also known as the Duchess class, also known in some quarters as the City class. These were introduced from 1937. They were very much an upgrade of the Princess Royal design, with a slightly larger boiler and a far higher attractive effort there too. Most of the locomotives, the initial batch, were applied with the streamlined casing that we see on the left there. This was mainly to compete with the A4 locomotives, to streamline designs there and have a sleek, modern looking train in this very fierce competition that was happening at the time for the fastest trains running on either the West or the East Coast main lines. However, Stanier himself didn't approve of the streamlining. It's commonly quoted that he did say, we'll build them the streamlined locomotives they want, but we'll also build them 5 proper locomotives as I intend them to look. And you can see on the right there, one of the locomotives without the streamlined casing. So there was 5 initially of these locomotives, some named again after members of the royal family, some named after duchesses, and some of the later locomotives named after cities, both on and off the LMS regions. So these came in, these really started to transform the services. There were several built. There was a slight delay during World War II, but more and more of these locomotives were provided with and without the streamlined casing, with the final versions of these Princess Coronations built in 1948. By this time, Stanier had long since left his role as the chief mechanical engineer of the LMS. He'd been replaced by Charles Fairbairn, who'd been subsequently replaced by Henry Ivett, who was building a lot more modern locomotive designs for the LMS, a lot more wartime style locomotives. And the final two Duchesses did have the influence on this design. They were fitted with more modern cabs and also roller bearings on the locos too. Some ideas that were pretty much a fantasy when the Princess Coronations were first designed, but it just shows you how locomotive development can speed ahead sometimes too. So looking at the models here, as I'm sure some of you are already aware, Hornby have provided brand new models of both the streamlined and the unstreamlined Coronation in their range over the last few years. Brand new models of these have come out to replace those tooled up around 20 years or so ago now. These are fully super detailed, whether you're looking at the locomotives that work the Coronation Scot train, or the locomotive on the right of the screen here that you see in the wartime condition. This is one of these locomotives that had the streamline casing removed, and you can see the characteristic slope at the top of the firebox, the smoke box there, sorry. The slope at the top of the smoke box indicating that this is where the casing was removed from. So these locomotives again stayed at the forefront of the London Midland Scottish Railways express services right through to the mid-1960s, working alongside the Princess Royals, becoming part of the British Railways Empire and operating in the later liveries there too. But Stanier hadn't quite finished yet. Heading back a couple of years now, we're heading into the wartime period. Stanier did want to improve some of his earlier designs too, where we've had the Jubilees that got some improvements. He also wanted to make some amendments to the previous designs, the Fowler Royal Scots and Baby Scots, to improve the reliability of these locomotives too. So in 1942, two of the Jubilees were rebuilt with Stanier boilers, as we see here, looking very similar to the rebuilt Royal Scots that would come a little bit later. There was only two of these Jubilees rebuilt, but they did then pave the way for other designs. If you want to pick up one of these pair, you can pick up either the mainline railways model that you see here, or Hornby have produced this as part of their range too, which you can see if you check out our catalogue in the link in the description below. This, as we said, then gave rise to rebuilding the Royal Scot class locomotives, which have now been pretty much outclassed by a major range of locos, including the Princess Royal, the Jubilee, and the Coronation. All of the Royal Scots were authorised for this rebuild, as we see here, with a brand new boiler using the original chassis and a replacement Stanier tender. All of 70 of the locomotives were rebuilt between 1943 and 1955. So it was a full upgrade for these particular locos, completely changing the look from the original parallel boiler design that we see back there on the Bachmann model. Fortunately for modelers, we have got several of these rebuilt Royal Scots available that you can pick up. In N-gauge, you've got the Graham Farish model of the rebuilt Royal Scot, whilst over in double O gauge, you have the original mainline railways model from the late 1980s, which is again a great way to get in for a cheap price to get one of these express locos. Hornby have tooled up a fully new model of the rebuilt Royal Scot around 12 or 13 years ago now, which you can pick up in a variety of guises, including the preserved locomotive that you see here, number 46100 Royal Scot, which did spend some time in North America just after it was constructed. To finish the story of the rebuilds, 18 of the Patriot locomotives were also rebuilt. These were rebuilt between 1946 and 1948, again with a very similar style, looking very similar to the rebuilt Royal Scots and Jubilees. We can just see one of those rebuilt Patriots here in the early BR livery, and again you can see on the box art there the similarity between the rebuilt Patriot, the rebuilt Jubilee that we looked at first, and the rebuilt Royal Scot. There was very little in it for these locomotives once they had been rebuilt. So again, all of those rebuilds are available. There is something a little bit more unusual, but it does show you just how locomotive designs were continuously developed and improved upon to the point of locomotives were being rebuilt. It's interesting to think in some cases this was the second rebuild for some of the locomotives, with some of them having been rebuilt from the London North Western Railway Claughtons that we mentioned earlier. We're finished with steam locomotives now. While it does say express locomotives of the LMS in our video description, not all of them are steam locomotives, and the LMS were one of the first to start experimenting with mainline express diesel traction. This came in under Henry Iver towards the last days of the LMS as a private company. Privatization was heading its way in the post-World War II world, and this came in 1948. But not before the introduction into service of 10,000, the first mainline major express locomotive built and operated on the UK's railways. This was a partnership between the LMS at Derby using English electric diesel parts and an English electric 16-cylinder power unit. These locomotives, there was two of them, numbered 10,000 and 10,001. Whilst they were intended to work on express trains in pairs, they were also relied on to work mixed traffic duties and lighter passenger workings on their own. They had 1,600 horsepower each, so they worked out at probably the same haulage capacity as one of the Patriot locomotives. So putting a pair of these together really would give you a very powerful setup indeed. The first locomotive entered service days before the end of the LMS in December 1947, with the formation and the grouping into the nationalisation of British Rail in 1948. The second locomotive, number 10,001, entered traffic under British Rail, although it had been mostly completed by the LMS. And these distinct diesel prototypes really did give a lot of basis to locomotives that came afterwards, influencing British diesel locomotive design for quite a few years. And you can see some of the items there that got carried on, including the body style that was very similar to the Class 40 and Class 37 diesels. Also, the power unit in there was then developed further into most of the English electric designed locomotives entering service from the 1950s to the 1960s. If you're looking for a model of the LMS 10,000, we did produce a model ourselves around 10 years ago as a limited edition with Dapol. They are all sold out now, but they do come up from time to time in both the black and the later green liveries too. This model that you see here is part of that range, but Bachmann have produced a model of this locomotive too that again you can pick up in 00 gauge from our pre-owned collection from time to time. If we have any available, head over to the link in the description when you're watching this to see what we have available right now. And that pretty much concludes the story. Steam locomotives were further developed as part of British Rail's development programme, but the diesel that we saw there really showed the way things were going. That's something we can certainly cover in a future video, but we've covered 25 years of LMS Express locomotive history here today, and we've shown you some of the locomotives and models that you can pick up right now. So I hope you've enjoyed the video. I hope you've learned a little bit more about the various designs and where they all sit in with each other in an LMS modeller's fleet too. If you'd like to see more of these videos, don't hesitate to get in touch with us and let us know what you'd like to see. If you have enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and like our Facebook page, where we've got many more of these real railway profile videos. all the latest model railway news and our popular skills cast sessions too. Otherwise, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.